Ungrateful woman disowns the man who raised her, but his hidden $7 million shocks everyone. When the neighbors saw old Thomas walking out of the house he built with his own hands, clutching a worn suitcase and a faded photograph, no one stopped him. They whispered instead. After all, who would imagine that the white woman inside, the daughter he raised from infancy, had just thrown him out? For years, Thomas had been her protector, her teacher, her father in every way but blood. Yet when the truth about her inheritance surfaced, she turned her back on him without hesitation. What she didn't know was that Thomas carried a secret, one that would shake the entire town and leave her world in ruins. Thomas Johnson had worked every day of his life since the age of 12. Born into poverty in rural Georgia, he knew what it meant to fight for dignity in a world that often denied him the simplest kindness. By the time he was 40, he'd saved enough from his carpentry business to buy a small plot of land on the edge of town, a place that would one day become his refuge. One rainy night, as he returned from work, he found a baby left at the church steps, wrapped in a pale blanket with nothing but a note. "Please give her a home." Thomas didn't hesitate. He raised the child as his own, naming her Grace, believing that love could bridge the gaps that hate had carved into the world. For years, the town frowned upon its bond. Whispers followed them in grocery aisles. Grace went to school facing questions that stabbed deeper than insults. Yet Thomas never flinched. He gave her education, comfort, and love. But as Grace grew, so did the distance between them. When she left for college, she rarely called. And when she returned years later, she carried the polished arrogance of someone ashamed of her past. The house Thomas built, their home, soon became a battleground of pride and pain. It started with papers, envelopes filled with legal words that Thomas couldn't fully understand. Grace claimed she needed to update the property records, saying the bank required his signature. Trusting her completely, he signed. What he didn't know was that Grace had transferred the deed into her name. Within months, she began renovations, changing everything he had built. The old oak furniture, the family photos, and even the rocking chair he'd carved by hand disappeared. When Thomas asked why, she smiled politely and said, "It's time to move forward." But forward meant erasing him. Neighbors noticed how Grace treated him, how she spoke to him as if he were an inconvenience. Some said she had friends from the city who questioned why she still let that old black man live in her house. Grace laughed it off, but each word dug deeper into her conscience. Thomas stayed silent. He still cooked breakfast for her, still mowed the lawn, still waited for her to see him again as the man who'd raised her, not the man the world wanted her to see. The breaking point came one autumn evening when Grace hosted a dinner party. Thomas, dressed neatly in his old cardigan, came to greet the guests. But when one of her colleagues asked, "Oh, is this your gardener?" Grace didn't correct him. Instead, she nodded and said softly, "Yes, he helps around." Thomas's heart broke silently that night. A week later, Grace handed him an eviction notice. She said it was for his own good, that he'd be better off in assisted living. He didn't argue. He packed his suitcase, kissed the doorframe he'd once built with trembling hands, and walked away. But Thomas wasn't as helpless as she thought. Inside his old satchel lay the last piece of paper she'd never seen, the one that would soon reveal who truly owned everything she had claimed. When Thomas left town, Grace thought she was finally free. She sold the house, bought a new car, and began hosting charity events, smiling in photographs, building a life built on image, not integrity. But 6 months later, a letter arrived from a law firm she didn't recognize. It contained only a few words. "You are hereby summoned regarding the estate of Thomas Johnson." Confused, she attended the hearing, expecting perhaps debts or closure. But as the lawyer read through the documents, her confidence began to crumble. Thomas had not been penniless, far from it. Through decades of careful saving, real estate, and community investments, he had amassed a fortune of over $7 million. And in his will, he left it all, not to Grace, but to a scholarship foundation bearing her mother's name. Gasps filled the courtroom. Grace sat frozen as the lawyer continued. Thomas Johnson's final note requests that his adopted daughter be reminded that wealth is not inherited through blood, but earned through gratitude. The will included one last letter for Grace. It read, "My dearest Grace, I raised you not to owe me, but to honor what we built. If you ever learn the meaning of love beyond pride, then you'll understand what family truly is." She broke down in tears right there, realizing too late that the man she'd cast aside had given her everything, even the chance to redeem herself. Months passed. Grace lost most of her friends when the truth came to light. The town that once whispered about Thomas now spoke of his generosity, how he'd secretly paid for dozens of children's education, repaired homes, and built shelters. The scholarship fund bearing her mother's name grew quickly, changing lives across the state. Reporters came to cover the story, calling it the legacy of a forgotten father. Grace began volunteering quietly at the foundation, never speaking about her past, but working tirelessly to continue his mission. Each morning, she walked by a framed photograph of Thomas that hung in the entrance hall. Beneath it was engraved, "He taught by doing, gave without asking, and loved without condition." Every time she saw it, guilt and gratitude mixed in her chest. She finally understood that her father's greatest gift wasn't the money, it was the lesson that no amount of shame or pride could erase love freely given. And as she stood before the young scholarship recipients, many of them children of color, she realized Thomas had built something much bigger than wealth. He had built a legacy. The story of Thomas Johnson became more than a town legend. It became a reminder that racism, greed, and pride might blind us temporarily, but truth and kindness always outlive them. Because sometimes, the wealthiest person in the room isn't the one with money. It's the one who knows the value of forgiveness,